Who has read one of Avdi Grimm's books, notes, screencasts? Fantastic. We've got a room full of fans. Please put your hands together for Avdi Grimm.
Hello, Barcelona. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit intimidated to be here. As some of you may know, I run RubyTapas.com, where I publish very small videos about Ruby topics twice a week. And I think I know one or two things about Ruby, but I think when it comes to tapas, you all know a whole lot more than I do. So, but I have to say, I am just so thrilled. I am so excited. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be schooled in tapas. Today, I want to show you some stuff. I want to show you some code. Recently, I wrote a library called Not. And Not is a toolkit for generating null object classes. Now, don't worry. This is not one of those talks where I show you some brand new library I just wrote and tell you all to go use it in your production applications. It's not one of those talks. I just want to share some of the fun parts of implementing this library with you. But let's lay some groundwork first. Who here is not familiar with the null object pattern? Wow, everybody knows what the null object pattern is. I see one or two hands. This is fantastic. I think I think every time I've done this talk this year or a talk related to it, I've seen fewer hands go up. So I think it's neat to see the patterns knowledge kind of growing in this community. But there are a few people that might not know or might be a little bit rusty on it. So just for a really quick background, as fast as possible, let me show you what the null object pattern is. Here's a method. It doesn't do much, but it's pretty chatty. It logs a bunch of information. And it has this parameter, a logger parameter. The logger might not be there. It might be nil. And since the logger might not be there, each time this method says something to standard out, first it has to check if the logger is there with an and then it uses the logger if the logger is there. Here is a null object implementation of a logger interface. It implements all of the standard logger methods, but each one just does nothing. This is a null object. We can take this null object and we can apply it to our chatty method, and we can make our default logger a null logger instead. And when we do this, it means we can get rid of all those and-ands. We can get rid of all that uncertainty, because if the logger isn't specified, if it's the default logger, all those calls will still work. They'll just do nothing. So that, in a nutshell, is what the null object pattern is all about. OK, so obviously, from what you just saw, we don't need a library to implement null objects. They're very, very easy to implement ourselves. So why would I write a null object library? Well, one reason is that I wanted to make easy things even easier. So here's an example of using Not to build the exact same null logger object that we had before, or actually the exact same null logger class that we had before, because this is a library for creating classes. And you can see what we do is we say not.build, and then we say config.mimic, and we give it the class we want to mimic. And what we get out of that, and then we take the result of that, which is a class object, we assign that to a constant called null logger. Now we have the exact same thing we had before. So it's a little bit more of a convenient way to generate a null implementation of all those methods that logger implements. Another reason I implemented this was I wanted to provide some different options, because it turns out there are a lot of little variations on the null object pattern, and I wanted to give people a way to explore some of these different variations. So this top version here is an example of a black hole null object. A black hole null object, instead of just doing nothing and returning nil from each method, it does nothing and returns itself. And then you can then call another method on that, and it'll return itself, and so on. The reason this is nice is because it enables us to chain methods on the null object, and it will just nullify the entire chain of methods, for instance, using the shovel operator. We often, we often chain the shovel operator. Another example here is the concept of a traceable null object. So this is a null object which knows the file and line on which it was instantiated. And this is kind of nice when you're debugging and you're trying to figure out where a null object came from. Now, I would like to tell you that in creating this library, I was working on some code for my business, and I needed a whole bunch of null objects, and so I extracted this library out of that business case that I had. But I would be lying, because the truth is, I just really love metaprogramming. I think it's fun. It's something that I do for entertainment. And different programmers do different kinds of programming for fun. Katrina Owen talks about doing therapeutic refactoring code for the sheer pleasure of it. Some people like to do code golf, where you try to make the smallest possible program to accomplish something. This, believe it or not, is a fully functional to-do list written in 140 characters. I metaprogram for fun. And if you like to metaprogram for fun, Ruby is a pretty cool language to do it in. After all, Ruby is a language that was created to be fun for programmers, to make programmers happy. And it also has some interesting, its metaprogramming capabilities have some interesting characteristics. Now, Ruby, of course, is not alone in allowing you to metaprogram. Many languages have metaprogramming facilities. In the C and C++ family, we used preprocessor macros or template metaprogramming. In C# and Java, you have these elaborate reflection APIs that allow you to generate classes on the fly. In Lisp, of course, is famous for its metaprogramming abilities because everything is composed of S expressions, and then you can apply macros to those S expressions which make up the code. But there's kind of a familiar thread that runs through all of these different metaprogramming facilities from different languages, which is that there's kind of two levels here. There is the world of programming, and then there is the world of metaprogramming. And you're either on one level or you're on the other level. And so you have kind of these parallel universes. Ruby, I've realized is a little bit different. Ruby, it's a punk rock metaprogramming language. And what I mean by that is that in Ruby, when Ruby wants to sew a patch on its pants, it doesn't take the pants off first. It just sits down and sews the pants right on where it sits. And sometimes it sews the pants to its leg in the process, but these things happen. It's not a catastrophe. As an example, here's some Ruby code, very simple Ruby code. We've got an array, and we can ask that array what its size is. This is programming. We can also ask that array what methods it has. This is metaprogramming. It's very simple metaprogramming, but this is metaprogramming. It's asking it's not asking the object to do something. It's asking, what can I ask you to do? And it's the same. It's at the same level. There's no special syntax for this or anything. And then on the next line, we can take what we return from that this list of methods, and we can ask that for its size. And now we're back to programming. So the programming and the metaprogramming, it's all kind of intertwined together. There's no separate levels. And I think this is why I enjoy metaprogramming in Ruby so much. Anyway, back to the code. So as I said, not is a library that's all about generating new classes. So when we use not, we assign the result to a constant because the result is a brand new generated class. Now, if we're going to be generating, so how do we generate classes in Ruby? Well, when we want to generate a new object in Ruby, we send the object class, the new method. When we want to generate a new class in Ruby, we send the class, the new method. I love the parity here. It's the same. If we want to determine, if we want to set a different base class for the generated class, we can pass that in as an argument. For instance, passing in basic object. Now, the result of this process, by default, is an anonymous class, which is kind of ugly. It just has a big, long number. But the first time we assign that to a constant, it takes on the name of that constant. And from then on, it knows its own name. And this is a little bit surprising at first, but I find it very convenient. So that's how we generate classes. So how do we generate a null class? Well, we start off by simply saying class.new, like we just saw. And it seems like a good default implementation of a null class would be a class whose instances simply respond to any message with nil. It seems like a good out-of-the-box default. So how do we do that? It turns out to be incredibly simple. We have our class.new here. Inside the block that we pass to class.new, we just define two methods. We define method missing, which is going to be called anytime a method that isn't understood, a message that isn't understood is sent to this class. And we pass it what I've seen called the naked splat. It's just a single asterisk. And what this means, if you haven't seen this before, what this means, it simply means accept any arguments and ignore them. Do nothing with them, but accept anything. And we don't even need to provide a body to this method, because Ruby, by default, when it has a method with an empty body, it returns nil from that. So we're done there. And the only other thing we need to do is we want this object to also report that it responds to any message, so we also define respond to. And again, accept any arguments, this time return true for everything. And that's it. We're like 80% of the way done with our null object library with just these few lines of code. Piece of cake. This kind of stuff makes me happy, brings me joy. I've been thinking lately about what different things bring me joy. And one of the things that has most consistently brought me joy throughout my life is music. Has anyone here seen the movie Garden State? Few people. Cool. I love that movie. And there's this scene in that movie that has always stuck with me. Zach Braff's character, Natalie Portman's character, are in a doctor's waiting room. And Portman is listening to music on a great big pair of headphones. And she says to Braff, "You gotta hear this one song. It'll change your life, I swear." And I love this scene because it just states so succinctly how I feel about some of the music that has moved me throughout my life. And this gets me to thinking, has any code ever made me feel that strongly? Can a piece of code change your life? And I realized Ruby changed my life. See, long ago I worked at a great big faceless corporation. I wrote a lot of C++, even some Visual Basic. I filled out a lot of TPS reports. I wasn't very happy. And then I learned Ruby. And it was fun. It made me happier. But there was more to it. I got involved with the Ruby community. I met people who were organizing meetups. Meetups with other programmers to talk about programming for fun. They were organizing conferences like this one for fun. They were optimizing their lives for happiness. And sometimes that meant optimizing their jobs for happiness. And meeting this community has led me on a long trip, which has led me to this point, a much, much happier hacker today because of Ruby. Anyway, back to the code. So far, we've been building null classes on top of basic object. But I wanted to allow users of Not to vary the base class. To be able to, for instance, say that the null class is built on object instead of basic object. One of the reasons I wanted this to be possible was because I wanted to implement a feature I call impersonation. Impersonation is kind of like mimicking, only taken a step further. See, sometimes you have some code, some legacy code, which has explicit type checks built into the code. It's explicit checks for what class an object is. And if you want to introduce a null object to that code and have it work, the only way you're going to be able to have that null object pass the test of those explicit type checks is to have it actually be of the type that it expects. And so I wanted to be able to say, we're going to have this null class impersonate another class. And what that means is that it's actually going to inherit from that class. It's just going to inherit from that class and then take all the methods and replace them with null versions. Okay, but up until now, we've been saying not.build, and we've been doing all these operations inside the build block, which are all operations on the class that's being built. They're modifying this class that's being built. But if we might not even know what the base class is for that class that's being built until partway through the block, how can we operate on that class? We can't have a class if we don't know its base class yet. So now we've got kind of a chicken and egg situation. And I realized at that point that I was going to have to queue up some deferred operations to be performed after the base class was determined. So I needed a queue of operations, which could just be an array. I needed to arrange to process that queue of operations once the class had been created, once that base class had been determined. So I created a loop. After the build block was done executing, I created a loop that would just loop through that queue of operations and invoke each one on the class that was being built. Finally, I created a little helper for deferring operations. This helper would take a block, and it would convert that block to a proc, and it would stick that proc into the queue of operations. Now, we saw briefly earlier, we saw this concept of mimicking a class. We say mimic some class, and out of that we get a null object that acts like a logger. It has all the logger methods, but they're all stubbed out. Okay, so what is this going to look like now that we're deferring operations? So here's the original code for mimic. We have the module eval. Inside the module eval, we take the class to mimic, we ask it for its list of instance methods, and then for each instance method, we loop through and we define a null version of that instance method. Pretty straightforward. Here it is after I switched over to deferring operations. The only substantive difference here is that I've moved part of the code inside a defer block. That's it. I was able to change this into a deferred operation by just moving it inside that little defer helper that I made. I love this. It's clean. I've adapted the language to exactly what I want to say, because I can just say, OK, defer this block, and that's exactly what it does. And I've gotten a pretty major change in behavior for a pretty minor change in code. Back to Garden State. I've already said one reason I love this scene, but I think there's something deeper there. Because I feel like this scene says something really profound and true about the practice of joy. Because Portman's character in this scene is so moved by the music that she's listening to that she feels compelled to share it with somebody new, share it with somebody she's just met. And I think this is a fundamental truth about practicing joy. I think that joy is completed by sharing. We bring our joy to its full fruition when we share it with someone else. This is why I'm sharing this code with you today. One of the best ways we have as programmers of sharing joy with each other, of sharing ideas with each other, is through pair programming. I've had kind of an interesting history with pair programming recently. I've pair programmed on and off for many years, but for a big chunk of last year, I did nothing but pair programming. I became a consulting pair programmer, and I would take appointments for 2 hours at a time, and I would work with people on whatever they wanted to work on. And as a result of this, I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours pairing with dozens and dozens of different people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all different skill levels. And this process, this experience, brought me immeasurable joy. It also gave me something else. It gave me a new perspective. Now, I know what it was like to be a newbie to the Ruby community 10 years ago. But obviously, I haven't been a newbie to the community for a long time. Pairing with all these people gave me the opportunity to see what it's like to be a newbie to Ruby in 2012, 2013. And over and over and over again, what I heard from my pairing partners that were new to the community, they would tell me how welcoming and how warm and how excited and how friendly and how kind the Ruby community is. Friends, we have something very special here. We have something amazing that brings us together in this room and that has newbies to the community to this day saying how amazed they were at the warmth of their reception into this community. We have something unique in the Ruby community. So this process brought me so much joy that I've been trying to share some of that joy with others. I've been trying to encourage other people to do something something like what I did, to pair with other programmers, sit down with them at the same keyboard or maybe virtually at the same keyboard using screen sharing or some other technology, but to work with widely and diversely with other programmers, maybe outside of their region, outside of their office, and experience something like what I experienced in all these sessions. So I've been asking people to put this badge on their website, this Pair With Me badge, to let people know that they're open to pairing. I've been asking people to use the Pair With Me hashtag on Twitter, and whenever I see that, I retweet it, and I keep hearing from people who got to pair with completely new people because of the hashtag. And with the help of the community, I've been putting together some resources at pairprogramwith.me to help people do this kind of, particularly help them with the remote pairing, which I know has a little bit of a learning curve to it. And you don't have to take my word for how wonderful this experience can be. Here are just a few things that people have said about it since I've been doing this. Being re-energized in my quest to be a Ruby dev. I might be hooked on remote pairing. Wow, this Pair With Me thing is really deepening the sense of community I feel. How cool is that? And the neat thing is there are no excuses left. Even if you are a solo developer, even if you are in the middle of nowhere, if you have a computer and an internet connection, you can pair with somebody out there. We have the technology nowadays. It's great. Anyway, back to the code. Interface subsetting. That sounds pretty fancy, doesn't it? All right, well, remember Mimic. We've talked about Mimic a couple of times. If we're mimicking some other class, it seems reasonable that we want to mimic most of the methods on that other class, but we probably don't want to mimic root-level methods like object ID. We want to leave stuff like that alone. OK, so how do we filter these out? Well, the first thing we might think of is when we send instance methods, we could pass the false flag, which you might know just tells instance methods to only list the methods that are defined directly on that class, not the ones that are on any of its ancestors. But this breaks down pretty quickly. Let's say we have a subclass of logger called myLogger and adds one method to the logger interface. If we say mimic that myLogger, and we use just the false, we pass false to include super, well, now it just has one method. And chances are, if we're mimicking myLogger, we want to mimic all of the logger methods and the myLogger methods, and just not the root level methods. So this by itself is not sufficient. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, here are the building blocks we're going to use. First of all, we have the fact that we can send the instance methods message to a class, and we can get a list of methods back as symbols, specifically an array of symbols. And secondly, we're going to use the fact that arrays in Ruby have set operations defined on them. So we can do set intersection and set union, and we can find out the differences between sets using operators on arrays. So here's what we do. We take the class to mimic. We ask it for its instance methods. We subtract out the list of instance methods on object, and then we go through the methods and stub each of the remaining ones out. Simple as that. So interface subsetting turned out to be not as scary as it sounded. But make no mistake, this is a pretty advanced operation in metaprogramming terms. It's just really easy because of the tools that Ruby gives us. Let's talk about pair programming a little bit more. Here's something that I hear a lot since I've been talking to people about pair programming. I hear people saying stuff like, who would want to pair with me? I'm no expert. What do I bring to the table? Well, the truth is, you don't need to be an expert. I asked around recently, I asked people to tell me what was their most recent Ruby wow moment. And of course, I got a few responses that left even me scratching my head. But I also got responses like this: being able to reopen an object or class. How many people here know that you can do this in Ruby and could show somebody else how to do it? There you go. You have everything you need to blow somebody's mind. Okay, but maybe you're a total newbie to the Ruby language. Maybe you're a total newbie to programming. And you're thinking, I bring nothing to the table. Well, that's not true, and I want to explain why. I have kids. Does anybody here have kids? So if you have kids, you know that one of the special pleasures of raising them is that you get to rediscover the world through their eyes. Here are two of my children discovering track maintenance equipment. Now, if you don't have kids, you may not realize that by combining construction equipment and a train, track maintenance equipment is the most mind-blowing thing in the world. And I get to experience these moments with them through their eyes. I want to go back to Garden State for a second. In this scene, who do you think has the better deal here? Sure, Zach Braff is getting to listen to the Shins, but Portman's character is getting the very special pleasure of sharing something that she loves with somebody new for the very first time. And that is precious. When I have paired with newbie programmers, I get to experience these wow moments over and over through their eyes. I've learned new things about what I knew that I didn't realize that I knew. I've learned a lot about what I don't know. And through talking to them, I've learned how to put the ideas in my head into words. So if you're a newbie programmer and you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope you take this away from it. When you bring your beginner's mind to the pair programming table, you are giving your pairing partner a profound gift. Don't forget that. Something else that I've heard is that a lot of times people will feel intimidated. Like maybe they feel like the person they're about to pair with is way above their level, and they just feel intimidated. Oh, they're going to see how stupid I am, how dumb I am, how I spend all my time reading the documentation because I can't remember anything. I think this is the first conference this year that I've been to that Steve Klabnik hasn't also been to this conference. So since he's not here, I'm going to steal one of his stories. He has this great story. He started, after I started doing all this pair with me stuff, he started doing pairing sessions with people. And he has this story about he was pairing with somebody who was, relative newbie, and they hit a wall. They hit a problem that they just could not figure out, and they were pouring through the documentation. They were trying all different things. They spent like 45 minutes of this pairing session just like banging their heads against this wall, getting nothing done. And finally, towards the end, his pairing partner says, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that this has been, such a boring session of programming for you. And Steve says, dude, what do you think I do all day? I spend my programming days, banging my head against stupid problems. I can't remember anything. I look up the documentation all the time. I spend half my pairing sessions saying, I don't know. Don't be intimidated don't be intimidated into not pairing with somebody just because you think they're above your level. Just don't. We all do the same stuff day after day. It's all the same programming. Anyway, back to the code. So as you've seen, we have these various operations that we can do on the class that we're building, like black hole and mimic, and they all make changes to the class that we're building. And I had a bunch of these operations, and I was stuffing them all in a class called Null Class Builder. And as I created more and more of these, this got to be a pretty big class. It got to be over 200 lines long, which for me is kind of a warning bell that says maybe I should start refactoring this out. So I decided to opt for one of the classic refactorings. I would start sprouting off command objects. And here's an example of a command object for the mimic that we've talked about so much. We have, instead of just a method, we have a class which inherits from a command superclass, and it's inside a special commands namespace. It has an initializer which takes all the arguments which originally went to that mimic method, and then it has a call method which will actually implement the mimic logic. And then back in the command, here's how we use that in the original builder class. I could pare down that mimic method to just one line. It instantiates the mimic class and calls it, and that's it. So it's down to just like these 3 lines for each of those. But that's still there's this stub that's left behind in that class for each command that I want to add. So every time I add a new operation, I still have to add that stub back in, and it's tedious. And I want to get all that code out of there. I thought it would be cool if I could just have these commands be automatically discovered in that command namespace rather than having to leave a stub behind in the builder class. So first of all, I wrote myself a little helper to convert from a class name to a method name, and it's basically just camel case to snake case. And then I wrote a method missing on the null class builder, and this method missing, it says, okay, let's see if this method that we're missing, let's see if the name of the method corresponds to the name of a command in that command's namespace. If so, instantiate the command and call it. And since I'm a polite metaprogrammer, I also implemented respond to missing to implement the same logic, so it would know that when it can respond to one of those commands. So now, when somebody uses the build method and they use these different operations in there, like black hole or mimic, some of those might be from inside the null class builder. Some of those might be just auto-discovered from inside the command as command classes inside the commands namespace. But from the user's perspective, the client coder's perspective, it's completely transparent. But that's not all. Because these are auto-discovered based on whatever's in that namespace, and because we can always, the namespace is just a module, and we can always reopen modules in Ruby, I basically got plugins for free, because anybody who wants to add a new operation to the null class builder can just, as long as they put the command class inside the right namespace, inside the right module, and they load that code up, it'll be discovered, so they can add their own code very easily. How cool is that? All right, in conclusion. First thing I want to leave you with, obviously, metaprogramming is awesome. At least I think so. But even if metaprogramming is not your thing, even if you refactor for fun, or you do code golf, or you do speed optimization for fun, I want to encourage you to embrace these joyful coding activities, these types of program that you write just for fun, or the kinds of coding that you do just for fun. This is serious business. This is important. I think that when we do fun coding, when we make time for that, I think it stretches our brains in good ways. And I really feel like if you show me a programmer who is not writing some code that's just plain fun every week, I will show you a programmer who is not working at her peak effectiveness in her day job. And finally, it has been shown that people who code for fun once a week are 67% better at manufacturing statistics. So this stuff is really important. See how good at that I was? It's because I code for fun. This is an amazing conference. I think you will agree with me, right? This is a fantastic conference. And you're going to go home from this conference excited and energized and wanting to try new things. But that feeling is going to fade over the next couple of weeks, and it's going to fade and go away. And you might not be going to another conference this awesome for another 6 months or another year. I know a way to retain that energy, that excitement, every week, to bring it back every week. And I know because time after time, I've looked at my schedule at the end of a long day and said, oh, I still have a pairing appointment to do. I'm so tired. I just want to go watch TV. I don't want to do this. But then I would get into that pairing appointment with somebody halfway across the world. And by the middle of that session, I would be energized and I would be excited and I would be thinking new thoughts and I'd be jotting down ideas for future Ruby Tapas episodes. Every single time. If you want to bring back this feeling reliably, the best way I know to do it is to make an effort to pair with other programmers, pair with somebody you've never paired with before, pair widely and diversely. Try to do it once a week. An hour a week or 2 hours a week. Finally, I just want to encourage you to go out there, share your coding joy with other programmers. You never know, it might just change their life. Thank you so much. Happy hacking, everyone.
Hello.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for the talk, first of all. So, you've been talking about intimidation and newbies trying to pair program with pros. What's your call on conference breaks?
I'm sorry?
What's your call on conference coffee breaks, for example? What's, in your opinion, a good icebreaker for a newbie to approach you?
Oh, good icebreaker. Like what to work on? Is that the question? Like what to work on in a pairing session?
No. So, for example, in this conference, during the breaks, right? What would be a good icebreaker for a newbie like me or someone else to come to you and start a conversation with you who are a pro and
We could
really
role play.
intimidate us?
If I could do this, we could role play.
I suggest hello.
Yeah. For anyone that's interested,
Actually, yes, please come talk to me. I like talking to people, and I will admit to being a total introvert. And honestly, the reason I started giving talks in the first place is so that people would come talk to me at conferences, and I wouldn't have to I wouldn't have to start conversations myself. So I want to talk to you.
So, do you think there is an opportunity for a sort of community of people offering pair programming? Mm-hmm. I mean, for instance, I'm not really good at pair programming, but I'd love to learn, and then when I've learned, offer it. Do you think there is a way to build up an international community of this kind of offering?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of opportunity here. I mean, I actually made a living for like half a year doing pair programming, but even, you know, and I've seen like you saw in the slides, I've seen great uptake, you know, of people just pairing up on open source projects. I absolutely think that there's a seed of a community there. I've been trying to, like I said, collect information at the pairprogramwith.me site, but I don't know exactly like what form that community should take, and so I've just been kind of watching and trying to, you know, encourage it where I can. But I really encourage anyone to, if you have ideas for bringing people together for pairing, by all means, you know, implement them. Talk to me. You know, if you have an idea for bringing people together, talk to me about it. I would be happy to help. If nothing else, I'd be happy to just lend some eyeballs to it, you know, and get some exposure. And of course, if you want to pair with people, talk to me or tweet about it, and I'll retweet you.
I'm not going to mention it.
That's one thing I've been trying to do a lot is, you know, just making sure that anybody who wants to do it, they find someone.
Hello, Avdi.
Hello.
Question, productivity. How do you find time to produce so much stuff, so much content, books, conferences, all that?
How do I do all that? I don't sleep.
So that's the tip. Thank you.
Please put your hands together for Avdi Grimm.